Charles Darwin. We all know him from being the man that rocked Victorian society with his theory that all species have descended from a common ancestor. But before we talk about his theory of evolution and the way it influenced the world, and in particular Portugal, let's introduce the naturalist that's behind it all. Charles Robert Darwin was born in Shropshire on February 12, 1809, at his family's home. He was the fifth of 6 children of a wealthy family. His father, Robert Darwin, was a society doctor and a financier, and his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was an English physician and naturalist. When he was 8 years old, Darwin joined the school run by his preacher when his taste for natural history and collection had already acquired. In 1825, Darwin spent a summer as an apprentice doctor with his father before going to the University of Edinburgh Medical School. However, there he found the lectures dull and the surgeries too distressing, so he neglected his studies of medicine. In his free time, he learned about taxidermy, and in his second year, he joined the natural history group with radical democratic students who challenged his orthodox religious views of science. In the university, he also learned about marine invertebrates and helped in the botanical collection of his university. Since he neglected his studies of medicine, his father sent him to Christ's College to study a Bachelor of Arts and later become an Anglican country parson. However, he was unqualified for the exams and had to join the free course. During the first few months of Darwin's enrollment at Christ's College, his second cousin, William Darwin Fox, who was studying there, impressed him with his butterfly collection, introducing Darwin to entomology and influencing him to pursue beetle collecting. Through Fox, Darwin became a close friend and follower of the botany professor John Stephen Henslow. He later invited him to join the crew on the survey voyage on the HMS Beagle in his stead, to be a naturalist and a gentleman or companion. Robert Darwin objected to this voyage, but was persuaded by his brother-in-law to agree to and fund his son's participation. The voyage began on the 27th of December 1831. It lasted almost 5 years, led by the captain Robert Fitzroy. Having left England, they first made a stop in Cape Verde before reaching South America. They famously passed through the Galapagos Islands before going all the way to Australia. After that, they visited South Africa, before making another stop at Brazil and Cape Verde. Finally, they made one last stop at Açores. Darwin spent most of that time on land, investigating geology and making natural history collections, while the HMS Beagle surveyed and charted coasts. The English naturalist kept notes of his observations and theoretical speculations, and even sent many specimens to Cambridge. On September 20 of 1836, after arriving in Açores, Charles Darwin wrote in his journal, "In the morning we were off the east end of the island of Terceira, and a little afternoon reached the town of Angra. The island is moderately lofty and has a rounded outline with detached conical hills, evidently of volcanic origin. The land is well cultivated and is divided into a multitude of rectangular fields by stone walls, extending from the water's edge to high upon the central hills." On the next day, Darwin traveled to the center of the island. "I enjoyed my day's ride, though I did not see much worth seeing. It was pleasant to meet such a number of fine peasantry. I do not recollect having ever beheld a set of handsomer young men, with more good-humored, pleasant expressions." From the 20th to the 25th, Darwin stayed in Açores, where he journaled about the geology of the islands Terceira and São Miguel, and made observations about some of the fauna equal to the one in the United Kingdom and the population he encountered. On September 25, the HMS Beagle departed and reached England on the 2nd of October. Back at home in 1839, Darwin wrote the first notes on the future theory of descent, and in them had already established the parallels between the natural and the artificial selection. Later, in 1842, Darwin made the first draft of his theory, and in 1844 he wrote a long manuscript whose plan was practically identical to the structure of his 1859 work on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. When it was published, The Origin of Species achieved an immediate editorial success. On the day it was published, November 24, 1859, it sold out its 1,250 copies. The second edition sold over 3,000 copies in 1860, and until 1876, in England alone, there were 16,000 copies sold. For Darwin, this was an enigma, because he understood that the scientific community was not prepared to accept this theory, and he didn't think that the public would accept the downfall of fixist creationism. Still, Darwin was already known and respected by the public, particularly because of the works that he published about the research he did on the Beagle Voyage. In the last pages of his book, Darwin even foresaw the impact this theory would have. When the views entertained in this volume on the origin of species, or when analogous views are generally admitted, we can dimly foresee that there will be a considerable revolution in natural history. Many debates began after the publication of The Origin of Species, having involved scientists, philosophers, religious figures, and the general public. Darwin's participation in the controversy was reduced due to health reasons and his poor aptitude for public debates. In England, the defense of organic evolution was led by some of his closest friends like Lyell, Hooker, and Thomas Huxley. Outside of England, some of his greatest supporters were Gray in the US and Ernest Haeckel in Germany. The initial phase of the debate lasted about a decade and ended in the victory of the supporters of evolution. But how was the reception of The Origin of Species in Portugal? When it comes to the field of natural sciences, the theory had some implementation difficulties, largely because in Portugal, botany and zoology were in the process of inventorying, description, identification and classification of species according to the static models of Linneu and Cuvier. This was the case of the most famous Portuguese zoologist of the 19th century, José Bocage. As the curator of the Zoological Museum of Lisbon, he limited his studies to the fields of systematics. Perhaps the Portuguese culture wasn't too affected by Darwin's theory, because the first translation to Portuguese only showed up in 1930, 54 years after its publication in England. Darwin's work from 1871, The Descent of Man, was actually translated first to Portuguese in 1910, however, it didn't include any part about sexual selection. Still, most Portuguese scientists had access to French translations, which came out with very few years' delay. In his reflections, Germano Sacarrão defended that Darwin's evolutionism did not penetrate Portuguese universities, not even in the more recent decades of 1930 to 60, and that botanical and zoological scientific investigation was not influenced by Darwinism, with some rare exceptions. On the other hand, studies by Carlos Almasa indicate that, although Darwin's influence on the research of Portuguese scientists is not evident, Darwinism did not go unnoticed by some of the most prominent figures in Portuguese science at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the following. Júlio Augusto Henriques, future director of the Botanical Garden, defended his doctoral dissertation just 6 years after the publication of Charles Darwin's work, applying the theory of evolution by means of natural selection to the human species. This makes him the first Darwinist in the Portuguese academic community. As a university professor, he formed more than 45 generations of students in Lisbon and Porto, with his admiration for Darwin present throughout his career. Later, in 1882, he even wrote a paper called Carlos Darwin, in which he celebrated the life of the English naturalist. Another representative of Darwinism in Portugal was Júlio de Matos, who wrote the Illustrated Natural History in 1880. As a doctor, he was a very important propagator of evolutionism in Portugal. Even some writers shared their opinion about the theory of evolution, like Antero de Quental, whose philosophy was influenced by Charles Darwin, and wrote a sonnet in 1881 titled Evolution. However, the Portuguese writer Essa de Queiroz described the spirit of the time with his character João Ega from the book Os Maias. You want me to tell you what I think about Darwin? He's a beast. There you have it. Now give me the bottle.
Besides Antero and Essa, other Portuguese writers and thinkers, such as Ramalho Artigão, Teófilo Braga, Oliveira Martins, and Raul Provença, all assumed marked positions by evolutionism. In honor of the English naturalist, Teófilo Braga even published a synthesis of the Darwinian theory of Ernest Haeckel's anthropological Darwinism and the social Darwinism of Herbert Spencer. Francisco de Arruda Furtado did something similar. He translated various passages of The Descent of Man to Portuguese, including the omitted parts of sexual selection. This is probably the most important man to discuss when talking about the influence of Darwin in Portugal, seeing as he was the only Portuguese to correspond with the man himself. Arruda Furtado was a young naturalist from Açores. He published many articles about malacology, and Darwin even proposed to him a plan to study the fauna and flora of this archipelago. However, he sadly passed away at the age of 33 with tuberculosis, leaving a manuscript titled Malacological Exploration Program of the Açores Seas, which to this day hasn't been completed. In 1882, the year of Darwin's death, Furtado wrote about the life and works of Darwin in different papers, where he presents himself as an humble disciple and Darwin as the Newton of biology. He also talks about Darwin as the creator of a new philosophy based on scientific hope, saying that Christ sees humanity as decaying sinful beings, while Darwin sees it as something that keeps evolving from its obscure origin. He does something that Darwin never did, which is to oppose Darwinism to creationism. After Darwin's death, in 1882, his ideas kept being discussed in Portugal, more at the elite part of society. Here the theory of evolution was received with open arms by some and closed by others. Nowadays in Portugal, the National Scientific Culture Day is celebrated on November 24, not only the birthday of Rómulo de Carvalho, but also the day that The Origin of Species was published. Now, more than 160 years after Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species, we can say that things changed a lot. Today, every biologist believes in the theory of evolution, and science is much more present in our society and accessible to everyone.